So today's first brown bag talk will be led by Dr. Sarah Blessed Sayah, and the title of her presentation is "Are You Just Here to Collect Data and Go? Researching Vulnerable Groups, Self-Reflection on Ethical Practices by Kant and Honeth." And so, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Sholofelo, who is chairing the presentation. And just to let you know that the presentation is going to be recorded, and so feel free and take part. So, Sholofelo, over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany. I also want to welcome everyone to our first BBT of our second semester. And I also want to extend my greetings to everyone who's going to join this session online. Our guest today is Dr. Sarah Blessed Sayah, and her interesting topic is titled, "Are You Just Here to Collect Data and Go? Researching Vulnerable Groups, Self-Reflections on Ethical Practices through Kant and Honeth." Dr. Sarah Blessed Sayah is an experienced teacher and researcher in the field of education and migration studies. Her doctoral research focused on equitable access to education for undocumented migrant children, which is children born to undocumented migrants in South Africa. She is currently a centennial postdoctoral fellow at Wits University, South Africa. Dr. Blessed Sayah is an advocate for transformative migration policies that center around educational opportunities and outcomes for children in vulnerable conditions. She completed doctoral studies at Wits University in 2023 and is a member of the Human Development and Capability Association. Dr. Blessed Sayah is also a member of the Center for Refugee Studies at York University in Canada and a registered educator with the Ontario College of Teachers. Dr. Blessed Sayah's interests are on equity, ethics, and the capability approach, human development, and education. Dr. Blessed Sayah, we are incredibly honored, privileged, and just like your name, we are blessed to have you here today. We have allocated 30 minutes for your presentation, and once you exceed the 30 minutes that is allocated to you, I am politely going to wave my hand as an indication that your time is up. And immediately after your presentation, we're gonna have our discussant, Dr. Chinwene Piri, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Higher Education Human Development here at the University of the Free State. Dr. Chinwene, the same principle and method of waving hands will also apply to you. Then lastly, we'll have a question and answer session where we are going to accommodate all the guests who are going to participate in this session online and in person. And I'm just gonna humbly appeal and request everyone to keep their questions brief, but without compromising the essence and details of your question. Dr. Blessed Sayah, I'm now going to hand over to you to continue your presentation. Good luck, and your 30 minutes starts now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, it's good to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Tiffany will help me with moving my slides. I'll just indicate to her when she needs to move to the next slide. So once again, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to present at this brown bag session. And I look forward to the discussions that will come afterwards. Like Tiffany earlier mentioned, my presentation focuses on a manuscript I wrote for my doctoral study. And the presentation is titled, "Are You Just Here to Collect Data and Go? Researching Vulnerable Groups, a Self-Reflection on Ethical Practices through Kant and Honeth." Slide 2, Tiffany, please.
Tiffany, can you close the side panel and the recording notification when she gets ready? Just click
Tiffany, can we please move to slide 2?
on the X on the corner.
Or on the X one. This one?
Yes.
Or this one?
In the other one too.
Okay, so I'll begin with an introduction, and
Thank you.
I'll just go ahead to explain. Sorry, Tiffany, I think we've moved more than, if you go to slide 2, the content page. All right, okay. So for this presentation, I'm going to begin with an introduction, and then I'll move ahead to explain my position and, specific context of reflection. Then I'll move on to discuss the moral perspective and its significance for conducting research. I'll then talk about Honeth's theory of recognition and a moral perspective. And then I'll move to my own reflection. And lastly, I will just briefly talk about the need for ethical considerations during research, practices, sorry. Slide 3, Tiffany, please. Okay, there. So basically, in this manuscript, I reflect on the need to reconsider from a moral philosophical perspective what ethical considerations should entail when conducting research with people in vulnerable positions. And in this specific case, it's for undocumented migrant children and their parents. Now, in my thinking, I believe that enacting such reflective practices can result in different ways that ethics can be contextualized and appropriately implemented across various spaces, not just limited to educational research. Slide 4, please. Okay, so one of the things that I believe are important is for me to clearly highlight my positionality and the context from which I'm reflecting, because I think that has a lot to offer for any other person who wants to read through this manuscript and, take ideas from it. So here, my position first is that of a foreign and Black Nigerian, and I also use the word African woman who has lived temporarily as a postgraduate student and researcher in South Africa for about 7 years. Yeah, I remember it was for 7 years. And this particular position from which I stand provides the context and the significance of the argument that I make in this article. Now, I remember in 2021, when I started my PhD study, I worked with children born to undocumented migrants in the eastern region of Johannesburg in South Africa. And I remember that the particular area where I worked is a commonly known suburb for migrants from other African countries in South Africa. And just to bring this closer to the specific context from which I write, working with this group of children and their parents, undocumented migrants in South Africa, provided a particular level of complexity for both the participants and myself, being a researcher. Now, the thing is, South Africa is a highly nationalist state with heightened levels of securitization. And so from time to time, we have xenophobic outbursts at different levels of society. It's not just at the micro or macro level, it happens at different points. And we see this through different statements. We see this through different activities. And we also see this through different events that take place across the country. And so to reach the group of participants that I was going to work with, I had to work through an NGO, a non-government organization, and this NGO was run by the Catholic Church. And the aim of this NGO at that time was to bridge the educational gap for undocumented and refugee children who had either moved into South Africa or were born in South Africa from the time they, would arrive in South Africa or from the time they were born and up until the time when their parents could, eventually sort out their legal status in the country, which will then allow these children to attend public school. And just by the way, it's, largely unlikely for the parents to, sort out the children's paperwork before or within the time that they're supposed to be in school. Slide 5, please. Okay. So during the time I worked with this NGO, I began to understand the depth of what it might mean to carefully reflect on my experiences, my values, and my beliefs. So, for example, during the initial stage of data collection, I was directly asked by one of the children and also asked by some of the staff members at the NGO, are you just here to collect data and go? You know, implying that all I perceived or all I thought about the children and the project was just sort of like a means to an end, and which would be to just collect the data for my study and then leave. Now, in everyday language, we will call this helicopter research, which is basically where a dominant culture collects data from, historically marginalized and vulnerable communities without showing any genuine interest in their welfare. And here, I just want to state that dominant cultures refer to existing power imbalances between researchers and participants. And so some of the factors that will give uneven power imbalances could be age, socioeconomic factors, in this case, immigration status. And the nature of this kind of research is quite problematic because it's amplifies and reinforces the power imbalances that already exist. And it also highlights or reinforces the idea that participants don't have a choice in taking part in the research process. And in essence, they really can't exercise their agency during, before, and even after the research process has been completed. And so, in reflecting on the moral duty to cause no harm, I also considered whether I was an insider or outsider, given my own foreign origins as an African Nigerian female in South Africa. And so, on the one hand, in my own instance, I'm foreign, right? I'm Nigerian. So to my participants, I'm an insider. But you see, I'm in South Africa legally, if I can use that word. And so to them, I'm an outsider. Now, the other part I'm looking at is I volunteered at the NGO and I'm a qualified teacher. So for the staff working with the children, to them, I was an insider, but I'm also an academic and researcher, and so I'm an outsider. And I personally thought that I could empathize with people's struggles and difficulties as human beings. And so for me, that I thought about that as an insider perspective. But the truth is, I was just there to collect data, which put me on the outside view. And so I found myself negotiating and shifting boundaries at different stages of the data collection period. For instance, I would not remain and I could not remain an outsider while I went to the NGO every weekday for about 6 months, because there were days where I had to stand in for a teacher who called in sick last minute. And there were other days I had to join, or participate in extracurricular activities that were organized for the children by the management of the NGO. And so for me, this just explains my position or positionality, and also explains the specific context from which, you know, I'm reflecting in this article or manuscript. Tiffany, next slide, please. Now, there's something I want to say, and I thought of it as a caveat, but I didn't use the word caveat because I thought it would mean something quite different. So it's just a side note. So I know that ethical clearance is mostly limited to procedures, but I also recognize that such clearance is important for understanding some basic principles that underpin the practice of research. So while I go ahead to explain my thoughts, or to, you know, give my thoughts on what we should do and how to work with people in vulnerable positions, I also reckon that ethical clearances are important aspects of the research process. Slide 7, please. Okay, so here I'm just going to talk about the significance of a moral perspective. What I'll do is I'll explain what I mean by people in vulnerable positions, and then I'll talk about Kant's moral perspective. Okay, so to begin the discussion, I think it's important to, you know, define what I mean when I say people in vulnerable positions. And I found something by Clement and others. I think this was in 1991, I think, if I remember clearly. And they've basically said that people in vulnerable positions are individuals who are stigmatized, have low social status, and who have very little power or control over their lives. So what this means is that in the case of undocumented migrants, which this paper focuses on, there is an uneven dependence by the group on other members of society. And here the uneven dependence is because their lack of undocumentation makes them vulnerable, makes them have very little power or control over their lives. So now moving on to Kant's moral perspective. Kant is famously known to have developed the duty-bound or deontological moral philosophical perspective for a principle of ethics. And what he does is he uses the concept of the categorical imperative to explain this perspective. And in the first instance, he argues that everyone should act only on a rule. He uses the word maxim, only on a rule you can agree or allow to become a universal law. Now, while I have disagreement about the universality of certain laws, and you know, sort of like the general rule hanging over everybody's head, I think what Kant's perspective does here is that it gives us an explanation on how humans should be treated and what counts as just and ethical. And what counts as just and ethical is that which is applicable to everyone, regardless of any discriminating factor, influenced by either insider or outsider dynamics. Like for me as a researcher, such as the legal status of my research participants in this particular case. And so essentially, the categorical imperative is, I believe, underpinned by human rights implications, not just about the legality or universality of something. What is important is the need for us to act in ways that do not undermine the inherent dignity of individuals. Now, this is a moral imperative, it's a duty, it's an obligation for every human being. And it's basically respect for the inherent dignity of everyone. And so, on a second fundamental explanation, Kant's categorical imperative also highlights or states the need to treat individuals only as ends in themselves and never merely as means. what this means, or by implication, failure to recognize individuals as human beings with inherent dignity is in itself morally wrong. So basically, treating someone as a thing of only instrumental worth is unjust and unethical, because individuals have intrinsic value, and moral law requires us to respect that value. It's our moral duty to respect the inherent or non-instrumental value of every individual. Now, as things, individuals are viewed as tools for achieving selfish goals. So, for instance, as a researcher, my selfish goal would be to use the participants as tools from which I can, or from where I can get my data. Now, one implication of Kant's philosophical position for the role of research is the failure of researchers to see beyond vulnerable persons as objects of data collection. So, for example, like I earlier gave, researchers might view undocumented migrants as individuals who can only provide information about the process of documentation in South Africa. Now, what I want to say here is Kant's explanations have been criticized for the absence of practical steps towards ensuring that this moral perspective to ethics is achieved. So the reality or the practicality of this moral perspective is not seen. And so, Tiffany, can we please move to slide 8? Okay, and so what I thought about was the need for practical kind of moral philosophy to ethics. And this is one which I think is characterized by the principle of recognition. And so Honeth's theory of recognition provides the opportunity for thinking in practical terms about how we can ensure the inherent dignity of vulnerable persons is respected. And an example of this kind of practicality could involve undocumented migrants as ends in themselves, which means recognizing their full humanity, which, for instance, will be including their stories, aspirations, and vulnerabilities throughout the research process and in the reporting of research data. And so for me, Honeth's theory of recognition emphasizes a relational approach to ethics in research, where the dignity and worth of individuals are acknowledged through mutual respect and engagement. And recognition refers to ascribing positive status to individuals. And when I say positive status, I mean respecting people, but not just acknowledging their existence. It means a shift from viewing them as objects to recognizing them as collaborators in the research process. And so in essence, what I do here is draw on Honeth's theory of recognition and bringing it together with Kant's moral philosophy on ethics to illustrate the need for a materialist or practical way to understand ethics when conducting research with, vulnerable groups of people. And for Honeth, recognizing individuals can be achieved through mutual respect. I said that before, and mutual respect and recognition for another is described in 3 forms. And I'm going to talk about these 3 forms because I believe that by embracing these 3 concepts, researchers can create spaces that empower participants and allow for richer, more nuanced understanding of their experiences and perspectives. Can we please move to slide 9? Okay, let's begin with love. And I know lots of us think of many things when we hear the word love, but in this particular instance, love is a basic form of recognition which builds self-confidence, and it informs a fundamental sense of identity, which develops into mutual respect for others. So in simple words, if I love myself, then I can go on to love other people. That's the sort of layman's explanation of what Honeth is saying here. Now, like I said before, although we always think of love, through the lens of romantic or parent-child relationships, love informs this sense of identity. And love is reciprocal, it's suggestive of support, of care, and interdependence of individuals. And so, love as a form of recognition is not a one sided feeling of acceptance and trust. It, however, highlights an assurance of continued shared concern for both the one who is loved and the other who's loving. And in paying attention to undocumented migrants, we will treat them as people who have integrity, who have dignity before, during, and after data collection. And we can do this through showing love to them. And so this kind of explanation of love moves us from self to others and from others back to self, and symbolizes a rational kind of being where recognizing the humanity, meaning the freedoms, the intelligence, and self-directedness of other individuals, is held as priority. I'm looking at time here, and I'm just going to move on to talk about rights. So for Honeth, rights refers to the moral responsibility that each individual has concerning the legal rights of other people. And by implication, people can develop a sense of self-respect and awareness of their inherent dignity as free and equal members of the society when they are recognized by other individuals as holders of legal rights, regardless of their status. And so everyone must be recognized as having fundamental rights, which cannot be taken away or transferred under any circumstances. And so here I'm reminded of treating individuals again as people with inherent dignity. Can we please move on to solidarity? The next slide, please. Okay, there. So the last form of recognition is solidarity, and it refers to an interactive relationship in which individuals mutually sympathize with each other's distinct way of life because they respect themselves concerning a shared value. And this solidarity doesn't have to be only within certain groups. It can also cut across other groups in society. And essentially, solidarity as a form of recognition seeks to demonstrate dedication to the well-being and flourishing of others by highlighting the importance of promoting the dignity and the humanity across and within personal relationships. And I believe that solidarity links with agency in individual and collective forms. And I know that some people have argued against collective agency, but I think that for people in vulnerable positions or circumstances, a collective form of agency is meaningful for them, and can help them to form alliances to achieve freedom or equity and various other forms of freedom for them. And so by implication, individuals are valued for who they are beyond the boundaries of what they can do or what they can give. And we also recognize here that while group members may have diverse abilities, so as a collective, all of them have diverse abilities, we also acknowledge their contributions to that particular community and beyond that community. For instance, the migrant community in South Africa, at a larger sphere. Next slide, please, Tiffany. Okay, so bringing Honeth's ideas together, I believe that researchers cannot analyze ethics and ethical practices without considering themselves as carers, as morally responsible, and having self-esteem. And so if we operationalize love, rights, and solidarity within research, it would involve us creating environments where participants feel valued, where they feel heard, and they feel respected. So, for example, embodying love in research could mean fostering a supportive and caring relationship with participants, ensuring their emotional and psychological well-being is protected throughout the research process. And solidarity, too, for instance, will involve recognizing the interconnectedness of researchers and participants, and striving for research outcomes that benefit their community and the broader community. And slide 12, please. Okay, so I think that a seeming lack of understanding of what ethics and ethical considerations mean in light of recognizing the person and being of undocumented migrants in South Africa is, limited, or is a lack of it exists. So let me rephrase that. There's a seeming lack of understanding of what ethics and ethical considerations mean in light of actually recognizing the being and the person of undocumented migrants in South Africa. And so I argue that the starting points for researchers like myself in addressing ethical considerations for studies should first be this moral understanding or moral duty of what it means to work with people in such vulnerable circumstances. And again, to go back and linking Kant and Honeth, I believe that this lies in Kant's second explanation or formulation of the categorical imperative, where he says to treat people as ends in themselves and not means to an end. And slide 13, please. And so I had lots to say here, but I think I'm running out of time. So my own reflection, I realized that while I needed data for my doctoral research, I was also aware of the broader dimensions of ethics, given the vulnerability of my participants. And so what I did, or what I realized, is I consciously tried to balance the importance of the data and the moral duty or obligation to treat the undocumented migrants with respect and gain their trust, while recognizing that they are people who have intellectual abilities, they've got freedom, and they're also self-directed. And the other thing I'd like to say is because I was, trying to find the balance between just collecting data and my moral duty to my participants, I found myself showing mutual respect. I found that there was mutual respect, and I was able to treat them, as individuals and as human beings. And so what I ended up doing was incorporating participatory methods that actively involve the migrants in the study design, implementation, and in the data analysis phase. And then this collaborative approach was instrumental in, accurately, to the best that I could, reflecting the lived experiences, the needs and aspirations of the migrant community that I worked with throughout my research. And perhaps one may ask, what are the practicalities of alternative appropriate ways of conducting research in an ethical manner that's moral? And so I think this practicality comes down to to a context-based kind of practice. Tiffany, can we move to the next slide, please? And just to state, participatory methods of research have been highlighted by other researchers. I think I've found lots from Prof. Walker. I've found from Dr. Martinez Vegas, who are all people that are at the center there in UFS there, the HEHD. And so what I think is that we cannot do away with context, because what context does, it allows us a deeper sort of engagement with the communities that we work with. And we also keep asking ourselves about an assessment of what ethical dimensions we should include or exclude, depending on the context where we work. And I think it's truly beneficial for us as researchers. And I think that participatory is participatory in every sense, because when I allow for participation and collaboration within my research practice, what I'm doing is that I am respecting, I am caring, and I am allowing for the rights of those who I work with to be, I'm allowing for the rights of those that I work with to be upheld in different ways. And Tiffany, next slide, please, to conclude. Okay, so for me, I think that the insights that I've included in this manuscript advocate for a shift in research methodologies towards more inclusive, participatory, and ethically grounded approaches. And I think that in the future, we should explore and refine our ethical practices to ensure that participants or people in vulnerable positions can actually contribute positively to the research, and we can also contribute positively to their own lives. And I think that embedding such kinds of ethical considerations can not just advance scientific knowledge, but also uphold and promote the dignity and well-being of every participant, especially those in vulnerable circumstances. Okay, thank you. I'm done. I included a few of the references, and the last slide is just a thank you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sarah. The way your presentation was so interesting, I even forgot that I have to keep up with the time. Yeah, I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Piri to give his reflections and engage on your presentation. Over to you, Doc.
Thanks, Sarah. It's good to see you again after quite a long time. And thank you for the presentation. I think it was quite thought-provoking. I think it's an issue that is applicable in the context of all of us here, especially about researchers, and also some of us have been researching under similar contexts. So I think it's quite timely. I had the chance to engage with your paper yesterday in quite detail, and I think my duty this morning and this afternoon is just to kind of kickstart the conversation, respond to some of the issues that I found in the paper, and then I think that can also set the mood for the rest of the participants that come in, and also comment on your paper. So I'll try to be very brief. I know there's quite a lot in the paper, and I think with the restriction of time, you might not have engaged with everything that is in the paper, but it's quite beautiful. I think I'll just start by kind of summarizing what you're trying to argue in the paper. And I think from my understanding, just like everyone else, your paper tries to explore the ethical challenges that are faced by researchers working with vulnerable groups, particularly in the context of Africa. And I think in here we're talking of undocumented migrants and their parents. And I think you also try to argue for the need for more individual focus, or others who call it the deontological moral perspective, and you draw that from Kant's categorical imperative and also Honeth's theory of cognition. which you rightly, I think, explained in your presentation. I think overall what we are trying to argue is that as researchers, all of us, we must go beyond mere components of ethical clearance, ethical issues that we get from the institutions, and also take time to genuinely reflect on the dignity and humanity of the participants that we are working with. And interestingly, what I found most interesting, I think, towards the start of the presentation is your positionality, the way you explain the inside and outside the dynamics, which I think kind of illustrates and highlights the complexity of conducting research in what others would call a nationalistic or xenophobic context, in your case, being a foreigner. And I think you also kind of touch on the importance of ethical reflexivity, which is quite key, and also the potential harm of people. The research, which you also just explained earlier on. So towards the end, you also kind of advocate for participatory research methods that empower participants to recognize the inherent value. And I think you're drawing from Kant's ethics here, which are kind of serving as a guide towards treating individuals as ends in themselves and not just means. And I think Honeth kind of supplements that, complements that by bringing in underscoring the issue of recognition and issues of, I think, mutual respect, and those three pillars that I think you just explained: love, solidarity, and I think sticking to something like that. So yes, this is quite relative and important that as researchers we need to call for a deep understanding of ethics that considers the social political realities, as you just explained also. When you mentioned that the context is key, I think context is key, even though there are some other factors. But I think highlighting the context is quite very, very important, and I found very interesting in the paper. I had also a chance to kind of because other literature that kind of also support the kind of study that you're working on. And I found, I think, 2 or if not 3, interestingly, there is quite much literature around ethical issues in the context of Africa. But I did find, I think, just a recent paper last year by Makola, which also talks about the experience of postgraduate students when conducting research, especially related to research ethics. And I think it showed a big gap, that has to go back to the teaching of research ethics within universities. It was also quite interesting to know that most of the students reported not being familiar with the policies of ethics within institutions. And most of them will just do it for the sake of getting ethical clearance. Another one by DaCosta also talks about research not being viewed as purely just an intellectual exercise, whereas researchers, we are more or less looking at publishing, but also getting our names of profile our institutions in terms of what we're doing, but also look at the value of reciprocity. I think this is another key issue that I may add to your paper, also as very central aside context. And another one on Petition, I think, also argues around students' experiences with research ethics as being inadequate in the context of Africa. So I think this paper adds quite a lot of value in terms of how research should view issues to do with researching vulnerable populations. I think crucially, it reminds me of last year colloquium, what we had here, and I think Professor Mikatego spoke so strongly around ethics of trust, which is also quite key. She spoke around issues of repairing and maintaining trust in research processes, relationships, because it's quite key to researchers. And I think this also highlighted during the July HEHD conference this year also. She also kind of reinforced the idea that sometimes it's important to build trust with the participants as we are approaching research, whether it may be researching vulnerable context or any other context that we seem to be in a position of authority. So I think this paper quite adds a lot of value us here also as researchers, because it kind of reminds us quite a lot about what's our moral obligation when it comes to working with communities. So there are quite a number of sections that you have in the paper. I'll just briefly go through some of these sections. I know you didn't present it in that order here. I think on section A, what I liked most quite a lot is the positionality, which I've already explained. And I think you have really explained there that your status as a foreigner also kind of complicates your relationship with the participants. And this kind of duality can also foster a bit of empathy and trust, but also create, I think, barriers as you may be viewed with suspicion, but also as an authority figure from a different context. So I think to come up with this kind of research and some of the findings, I will find that as a strength in the paper. On section B, which you talk about the significance of moral perspective to conducting research with undocumented migrants. I think the definition of vulnerability, the definition of vulnerability is quite clear. I think you just well explained it in the presentation. Even though I thought also we needed a bit of more context, more explanation of what you meant by issue of undocumented migrants. I thought that was not very well clarified in the document itself. I think also in the presentation. And I think also the application of the Kant's deontological ethics, which you quite well explained, is a strong point in this paper. I think it resonates well with the idea that you have shared. And the focus on indignity, I think drawing from Honeth, also aligns well with the contemporary ethical discussions in research, especially when you're looking about vulnerable populations. And I think the argument that breaking immigration laws does not equate to a moral wrong is particularly insightful, as it challenges the conventional legalistic views, and also emphasizes ethical consideration over just mere legality. I did touch more on that, but I found out in the paper, and I thought it's a strong point that I needed also to emphasize. I thought, yes, much as theoretically it's quite very rich, I didn't see much of the application of the Kantian ethics and also on it, drawing from your own perspective, your experiences on the ground and what exactly you did, how that came up, and how did you navigate the challenges that came through. I thought that wasn't very much articulated in the paper, and that's what also during this presentation. And that's also where I draw another point of counter argument of these two theories. Yes, you spoke briefly about some of the arguments of Kant, but I think they needed a bit more engagement with other alternative ethical frameworks that could complement or challenge the issues that you mentioned within Kant and also and Honeth. And here I think I have in mind the Ubuntu that is kind of widely spoken within the African philosophical ideas. I think I'll explain it more in detail. But for now, I think that's what I saw in section B. And section C, that's where you kind of like explain the Honeth theory of recognition and moral perspective. I think that was quite insightful. You really effectively synthesized this one, and I think you also added in the paper these Hegelian and Median concepts. I feel like it was quite a comprehensive background that kind of situates the recognition within a broader philosophical context of the research on vulnerable populations. And also in the paper, there are some practical implications to researchers, which I think also was kind of like a strong point in the section. I thought there are some areas that also needed strengthening in section C when you spoke around the theory of recognition and moral perspective. And I think one of them is I appreciated the discussion on the theoretical perspective. It's quite rich. You were able to imagine one or two concepts were quite together. But again, as I already mentioned earlier on, that even within these, as you are complementing these two theoretical frameworks, we needed to see more of the empirical examples that could be originating from your experience. That can at least try to illustrate how we think Honeth theory can be operationalized in research, especially in a vulnerable situation just like the one that you are in. Probably a case study or a bit of a real-world application, something that you went through so that we can somehow try to link it with how you were able to navigate, how you were able to kind of address that in real life application. And interestingly, you also spoke around collective agency, and it's interesting to hear that and how you drew around the body of collective agency on that. I was interested, of course, as a question to kind of like understand what methods you used or one can use to make sure that you honor both the group's identity and also each person's unique situation. Because you spoke, you kind of motivated more quite a lot of collective agency, which is cool. But how can we also make sure that we do not undermine the person's unique situation in such kind of situation? I think my time is up, and maybe just let me pose some few questions so that I can open up to the conversation to the group. You kind of at the end advocate for participatory methods, and I was wondering in your research if you can share some ideas on what specific participatory methods you employed, because you mentioned something around that, and how did that kind of like impact on the data collection process? What are the challenges that you encountered while trying to implement these participatory methods? I think it's interesting to know, and how were you able to address them? How you were able to elaborate, how you maintain those confidentiality and informed consent within a participatory framework, which can also be very key, especially when you're researching that kind of situations. And finally, how do you reconcile the need for various data collection with the ethical imperative to respect participants' autonomy? I think I'll just kickstart the conversation with those few questions. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Sarah, just for a few minutes, you can respond to the reflection. I'll just give you 2 minutes so that I can open the floor for what you
I suggest you take a round of questions because there isn't much time left, and then she can use the remaining time to decide which questions she responds to.
Okay, what we're going to do now, we're just going to open the floor for a round of questions. Anyone who has questions, and we're also open for people who have joined online.
There are a few in the chat. I think you can have to have a look.
Oh, there are a few in the chat.
Or at least there are comments in the chat. Questions in the room? Okay. Daisy?
Daisy, okay, you can go ahead, Daisy.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah. I did enjoy your presentation. So just in addition to what you asked, I'm interested in finding out the aftermath of your project, like what mechanisms did you use to actually get back to your participants, owing to the fact that there are knowledge gaps between you and the people you're researching. So just the aftermath, the experiences after your project, after you had collected the data. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any questions here, but I don't know. Who's this? The insightful new perspective for novice research on how to look at participants, and as mentioned, ascribing to positive status to them and not as objects for data collection. I think this one is more of a comment. Do we have any other questions? Okay.
Thanks, Sarah, for your presentation. I had a question about trust. Chimema mentioned that I talked about this in a recent conference presentation, and I heard you mentioning it as well. So I wondered where and how you would situate trust in the process of building relationships with your research participants. And in relation to that, and also in connection to the idea of building solidarity, if you were able to show some vulnerability towards your research participants as a way of reciprocating or having a more equal exchange between what they clearly brought as vulnerabilities to the research process, and if you were able to share any of your vulnerabilities with them. And then a very quick one about Ubuntu. I'm not suggesting that you should draw from it, but I was wondering if you had particular reasons for not drawing on it, because it speaks so directly to issues of human dignity, personhood, and humanity, why you might have decided not to draw on that for inspiration on these kind of moral imperatives. Thank you.
Okay, any other question? Okay, I also have one question. I liked the part where you mentioned the issue of love and reminded me of a famous quotation of Che Guevara, where he says, a strong characteristic of a true revolutionary must be a strong feeling of love and appreciation. And I think if we had love and appreciation in Africa, or we embrace those ideas of people like Che Guevara, would you be having the current, and in South Africa debacle that we are having now in South Africa? I also want to hear what's your initial reaction about the current, this South Africa, debate and record, considering the fact that your research is more aligned, to the current, challenges that we're currently experiencing. Thank you. I think we can give you an opportunity now to respond to the question that we raised.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Chinwe. Thank you for reading through the paper. I've got 6 minutes. I will do my best to respond to as many of the questions that I can. And I will start off with the issue of trust, and I would link it to how I was able to, in practicality, navigate the space while I collected my data. So what I did practically was when I got there, I didn't just go and collect the data. Like, I volunteered there for 6 months, and within the 6 months period, I participated in activities that the children had to, because I talked to the children, I spoke to their parents, and then I spoke to the professionals in that space. So I joined the children to do all the activities they had to do. I joined them in the classrooms. And then I also, it was when I had gotten to a point where I knew that we had worked together for a while and they were comfortable and they knew I wasn't there to just, disappear. Then I started to, ask, okay, Sarah's doing this. If you'd like to be part of it, please let me know. And it was only after I knew they were willing to take part that I sent consent forms home for the parents to fill out and things. And the other thing I did was, this was not part of my research. I didn't include it in when I applied for ethics. What I realized was the children love to do artwork. And so when we were rounding off the data collection, I asked them if there was anything they, wanted to do. And they're like, oh, if you gave us something to color, we would be glad to do this. And so I ended up printing out worksheets and, they said they would like to write a few things, what they'd like to be and things. And so I made this worksheet and I gave it to them at the end to color. I included it in my dissertation or in my thesis, but it was not something that I had planned from the word go. But because I realized this was something that the children held dear, then I decided to, include this part in my research. And then how did I get back to them after collecting data? Now, because I was there, I stayed there till the end of the year of 2021. After collecting data before the end of the year, what I did was I reached out to some of the professionals I could get. I reached back to the parents I had talked to and asked them, and I said, this is what I've done so far. And would you like to say anything more? And I actually got people that said, Sarah, you didn't ask me how I managed to renew a document or how I managed to get a certain thing or how I've never gone back to do this. All you asked was this, this, and this. And I ended up having, more than one interview with one parent because they had said that they needed me to hear another part that I didn't ask them about. So that sort of back and forth allowed me to balance what I had in my own head and what they actually wanted to let me in on, even after I thought that my data collection was done. And for Ubuntu, I think sometime last year, I was talking to my postdoctoral host, Dominic Griffiths, about an Ubuntu paper. I haven't got into that yet. I think one of the big things that I struggled with in this particular manuscript is actually keeping to sort of like a limited word count because I had lots of ideas. So I think that's a very good explanation because the philosophical idea of Ubuntu actually has a lot to do with participation and mutual respect and understanding or accepting the intellectual capability of the person next to you and recognizing their humanity in essence. So I think that's a very good idea, and I will definitely maybe look to write another article about it, because like I said, I struggled with including and keeping to certain word counts in this one. And then how did I align my collection with my ethics? I'm not sure if I've responded to that, but let me see here. Okay, there was a last question about the current South African happenings and the idea of love. I didn't write that question in full, but what I think generally about immigration, or the people who are already in South Africa, and the idea of love, I think it will take us back to ideas about us mutually respecting. And I would use the word Ubuntu here, and just say that I think it's important for us as researchers, before we start off with just collecting data from a research perspective, I think it's important, or it will be important, for us to actually think about the moral duty that we have to not just ourselves, but to also the participants. Because what I realize is most of us, we're time bound, and we're thinking of lots of many other things. And the last thing that we might have in mind is to actually think of a way to care and to respect the people that we are going to work with. It's mostly about, I'll just collect the data and go. But I think that if we sit back and think about this from a sort of underlying perspective, I think it would help us to, go forward in collecting data, and also in reporting the findings of our studies, and also perhaps at a larger level, think about policy changes, and more importantly, implementation of policy in the South African context, for the benefits not just of the one group of people, but for everyone. Because at the end of the day, we need to see ourselves as beings and not as just things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Let's give it a round. Thank you very much, Sarah, for a wonderful presentation. This will be the end of our BBT for today. And I also want to appreciate the attendance of everyone who also attended online. We're now going to give everyone an opportunity to exit, but the people who have attended in person will remain for further discussions about the presentation. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Bye.
Bye.
Thank